This hour of historical fiction is brought to you by Headline Books, and I'm Carl Stewart. And the subject of the presentation today is the Western genre, specifically as it pertains to the book, The Legend of Seabird, The Last Long Drive. The Last Long Drive, the part of the Legend of Seabird trilogy, was the first book that I wrote, and it was the first Western that I had written. It was the first of three intended books in a set of Westerns based on the life and times of a real man. When I sent this out to Headline Books and they responded to the magic of Seabird, I was excited. Now, Seabird was a real Choctaw Indian. His full name was Seabird Carpenter, a man who lived from the 1860s all the way into the 1950s. He went from horses to atom bombs, if you want to think about it that way. Quite a lifespan. He was a wrangler, a drover, and a star in the early American rodeo. The setting of this particular slice of American pie was in 1884, Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas. In just the year following, 1884, the railroad came to Waco, and that ended the need to drive cattle across 3 states to get them to a rail line in order to move them to market. So the railroad killed the long drive, and thus the Chisholm Trail, hence the title of the book, The Last Long Drive. I chose the Western for my first book for 2 reasons. First, I learned to read from them. I mean, really read. Writers like Zane Grey, Luke Short, Max Brand, and then the fabulous Louis L'Amour were my teachers. From them, I learned not only how to decipher words, but also how to define my values. Each book was an instruction manual on the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, and encouraged me to back what's good and oppose what is evil. They also carried me away from the confusion and anxiety of childhood into a world of certainty, moved me from a world of gray mist to black and white, far from the troubled hills of West Virginia youth. That, and the fact that as an adult, I found the Western genre withering away as mediocre and cynical writers began pumping out what I call costume Westerns. These were Westerns in name only, populated by late 20th century men with late 20th century attitudes and values, embodying some shirtless hulks wearing a pistol and a cowboy hat and plopped down in the late 19th century. I wanted to take a stab at restoring the honor of real cowboys as I saw them. And that led me to my second reason for writing a Western. I wanted to honor the best man I knew when I was a kid, my great-grandfather, that same Choctaw named Seabird. From the time I was old enough to talk, he became my hero, the prime example for me of what a man was and how a man was to live. I emulated him as hard as I could and tried to make his values my own, values such as the following. I lived in a family where emotional blow-ups leading to violence was common. But Granddad kept his emotions under control and treated others calmly, with respect. His natural humility would lead him to walk away from trouble if he could, but to stand his ground if he had to. I lived in an area where cruelty to animals was common and commonly accepted. Seabird, in his own words, could not abide a man who would deliberately hurt a dumb beast. And by dumb beast, He didn't mean stupid. He meant it couldn't talk. It couldn't protect itself, as in deaf and dumb. I once saw him get up from his chair, dust himself off, and walk away rather than speak to a man approaching his house who had been cruel to his hound dog. And Seabird loved horses, as did I. My father knew him well and claimed that he, Seabird, was the real horse whisperer. He loved his horses so much. I remember when I was a little kid and I had toy spurs that would jingle when I walked and my little cowboy boots. I asked him why he didn't wear spurs. And he answered me something that has stayed with me all my life till right now. He said, if the only way I could make a beast do what I wanted it to do by hurting it, then I'm not much of a man. I lived in an environment when it was the macho thing for guys to lord over or denigrate women. But it was constantly clear to me, whenever I visited them, that he and Granny were true partners. And while men around me paraded their unfaithfulness to their wives, he lived true to his vows to his dying days. And when men I knew, including my own father, would commonly drink themselves into a stupor or smoke up a storm, Granddad showed me a man who didn't use any tobacco product and had a shot of whiskey only once a year to celebrate at his birthday party. He'd slam that down, and then everybody would cheer and the party would commence. There were many more reasons to admire the man, but the main reason I clung to him was because I knew that when I was around him, perhaps standing in his workshop, watching sparks fly from the wheel, or sitting of an evening on his front porch, watching him whittle out another Western scene that ended up being beautiful, but he would sell for $5 a pop at the local rodeo or county fair. When I was there, I knew no harm could come to me. I was safe. Growing up in the early 1950s, there's a big difference from now. The electronic footprint was minuscule compared to today. There were certainly no household computers, nor any internet, only dictionaries and encyclopedias, not Wikipedias. So if you were young and wanted information, and no library happened to be next door, you asked someone, usually an adult. Along that line, following Granddad's death, I would ply Granny with questions about the old days. And she would rock in her porch chair while she chain smoked her Pall Malls between endless cups of black coffee. She filled my head with tales of Seabird as a young man, tales of the Old West, of rodeos and cattle drives. She switched subjects only when I forced her to talk of her own youth, of the days of the feud between the noble Hatfields, of which she was proudly a member, and the nefarious McCoys. But more about them on Monday when I discuss the Last Long Drive's sequel, Devil's Backbone. In her small house, there were only 2 pictures of Seabird that I remember. One was of him on a bucking horse in mid-leap, him waving his black hat. It was the only picture she had of him in a rodeo. And sadly, when Granny died, that photo disappeared. I would go into her house when she'd be sitting on the porch on her rocker, and I would carefully take it down from her high bureau and stare at it for minutes. I believed if I looked hard enough, I could hear the thunder of hooves and the roar of the crowd. And then I would carefully stand on my tiptoes and replace it. The other picture of Seabird as a young man shows him in full rodeo regalia, all handmade by him. His ability to work leather and metal was exquisite. One time I asked Granny why she only had one picture of that man in a rodeo. And she said she never liked looking at him in a rodeo. I asked what he was like in a rodeo, and she said she didn't know. She went to every one she could, but she would always bury her face in her hands. She was too afraid to watch him. She would wait for the crowd's reaction before she'd look up. Now, Granddad, with his ability to work with these fabrics and metal, had what we nowadays call kinesthetic genius. It's a skill, or it's an ability that used to be highly valued in our society. These were the people, these were the men who were the blacksmiths. They were the mechanics. They were the buggy fixers. They became the first auto mechanics. They built things. There he stands in his chaps in this photo, arm gauntlets, and carrying a lasso he braided by himself. Nearby, out of view, was the saddle and war bag he also made. If he could see it, he could make it. When he retired from the rodeo, he did blacksmithing, leather work, and carved wood. My father once told me that Seabird, his grandfather, had such an amazing ability to make things that he must have had magic in his hands. That thought impressed me mightily and stuck with me all my life. Later on, as a writer, I would return to and incorporate that image in my writing. All this considered, for my Western, there was no question of who, when I came to construct a hero, that hero would be. Nor the setting. It had to be Oklahoma and Texas. The only problem here was I had never been to either of those areas. But that's where this amazing new invention, the internet, became immensely helpful. For instance, I discovered I could identify and contact the editor of the Bishonik. That's the Choctaw newspaper in Durant, Oklahoma. And with a punch of a couple buttons, when I had questions about traditional Choctaw life, roles, values, and beliefs, he or someone he knew would fill me in. He even invited me to apply for membership in the Nation, which I had to respectfully decline. So research for the book, instead of being a headache, like research was when I was a kid in school, became a joy, a fun voyage of discovery. I committed myself to spend up to 6 months researching before I would write page 1. That wasn't a struggle to do that. The struggle was to restrain myself to only 6 months. I discovered that by applying my energy, I could learn more in a day on the net than I could in a month in dusty library shelves. And another obstacle, I had never been to a rodeo. How am I going to write about a rodeo star when I've never seen one? So I started attending, hanging around, listening to conversations to catch phrasing and rodeo jargon, I even occasionally recorded conversations. What some might call snooping or eavesdropping, I called research. And little pocket recorders made it all possible. I grew to admire the polite, whipcord thin, and athletic young men and women who, in many cases, I found out were paying their way through college by racing their horses around barrels or trying to keep their 160 pounds in the saddle of a 1,400 pound animal that wanted them anywhere else but in that saddle. Now, attending rodeos is one of my favorite ways to research for Westerns. With this coronavirus, I frankly don't know if there'll even be one anywhere this year. You have to attend them. You have to sit in the crowd. And that's something right now that isn't likely. When I completed my research for the last long drive, I had a pile of notes and tapes, scrap paper, notebooks, anything you could imagine I could have found to write on. I examined them, organized them, and decided how and where to use them, where to place them in the story. I constructed a first outline of where I thought I could carry the plot and began pounding keys. Now, that would be nice if it all worked out as planned, but despite my outline, the story almost immediately from chapter 1 took off in an unintended direction, not following my plot. Originally, I had conceived a fairly traditional Western adventure, but what began emerging was the story of a young Choctaw Christian cowboy with magic in his hands, seeking to carve a path for himself in a world that relentlessly pressured him to deny his heritage and his deepest held values. I hope that the reader will agree that Seabird is a compelling character, realistically portrayed. I drew on him from life, and when I finished writing it, I sent this to my father, who knew Seabird very well. Seabird helped raise him, and asked him if he thought this was anything like Seabird, because I only knew him when he was an old man. My father on the phone responded, "You got him, you got him. If somebody read that book and met Seabird, they'd say, you're him." I would like to show you now just a few slides of this, of the tools and of this humble, unusual, taciturn superhero. And these slides would depict the life and times of Seabird Carpenter. Then I plan on having a short reading from the book just to give you some of the flavor. Now, bide with me a minute while I get these pictures up. Okay. I guess that one too. All right. One more. Oh, this says host disabled participant screen sharing. We'll try to work around this. Since we have nowhere else to go, just hold tight a minute.
What's up, Carl?
I keep getting a little rectangle that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yes.
X out of that.
Yeah, I will fix
I'll
that here.
He can do it now.
It'll work now?
Try
Yes.
it again.
All right, thank you. Ah, the wonders of modern technology. Aren't they a delight?
They are.
Here we go.
All right. Excellent.
maybe. All right. There. The Legend of Seabird, The Last Long Drive. There's only about 10 or 12 of these slides, so they shouldn't take a real long time. But let me take you through it. This is West Virginia. This is an absolutely uncommon picture that's very common down there. This is the landscapes that I grew up in, that I used to run when I was a kid. This is Seabird as a young man, standing there in a 125-year-old shirt. At least it is now. It wasn't when he put it on. Badly tinted, as they used to try to do with photographs that were black and white. But the thing I wanted to point out to you are a number of things. One, those beautiful chaps he's wearing. They're very smooth, no hair on them. Those were riding regalia. His arm gauntlets, wrist gauntlets of leather matched his chaps. Beautiful things. And in his hand, he's carrying his lasso, and that lasso he braided himself. Like I said, nearby was his saddle that he also made, and his war bag or war grip that he would take with him. Nowadays we take suitcases and wheels. Back then, as a handmade leather bag. Oops. There, that seems to have gone. These are some of the tools of the trade. This is a Winchester 86 model. He'd use this for hunting. He had to use a rifle pretty much, because one thing he was good at very many things. One thing he wasn't very good at was a pistol. He couldn't shoot a pistol worth anything. You ask him about it and why he couldn't shoot a pistol and he preferred a Winchester, and he said, well, with a pistol, slow is fast. In other words, there's a lot of guys that wanted to be fast draws, but they couldn't hit anything. So they draw fast and shoot wild. He would draw slow, and he'd say, drawing slow is shooting fast. It meant his bullets would hit. But he loved to hunt. And go hunting in West Virginia, they'd hunt for bear. When he was out west, this would be riding in a sheath alongside the saddle, 86 model Winchester. This is another tool of his trade, the lasso. It was an everyday work tool for the cowboy on the range, as was the rifle. If there were snakes, copperheads, coyotes, other things around that were not so useful. This was his partner, Granny. Granny and Seabird met when he drifted to West Virginia. She was a very young widow with a little baby girl named Gertrude. Her husband had been a sheriff in West Virginia in Logan County, and he'd been shot dead. And this was before Social Security, leaving her, a young widow, very young, with a little girl. She and Seabird met, hit it off, married. He adopted that little girl, and that little girl was my biological grandmother. So he is not my biological great-grandfather, but he was the only granddad I ever had. And here you just see her eyes all a twinkle. She was the one who lived on Pall Mall cigarettes and black coffee and could spin a yarn until it'd make your head spin. She reminded me more later on. There was a TV show. It's probably, many of you haven't seen it. It's called The Beverly Hillbillies. She reminded me more of Irene Dunn in The Beverly Hillbillies, Granny, than any woman I ever knew. Let's get that there. There. This young cowboy, standing right in front of the house that Granny and Seabird moved into when they retired. He got too old, sold the farm, moved into town. That's me at 11 months, being prepared to be a cowboy. I even got my pistol hanging down there by the side. I had no idea what's going on. I'm just a little fellow, but boy, I love that horse. What a nice, steady old creature it was. On my 4th birthday, Granddad Seabird made 2 sets of chaps for me. Actually, he gave them to me. It took him a while to make them ahead of time, just to show you some of the skill in his hands. He was in his 80s when he did this. These chaps are cowhide with hair. He didn't call them chaps. He referred to them as my hair pants. He'd say, "You still got your hair pants, boy?" I said, "Yeah, Granddad, I got the chaps. Yeah, I got them." But I didn't want to be like him. I wanted to be him, pretty much. All the good guys when I was a little kid wore white hats, but Granddad wore a black hat. He was the best man I knew. Doggone it, I was going to wear a black hat too. Even if people might have thought I was a bad guy. And don't worry about that pistol sitting next to me there. I'm mauling that with my right hand. I'm a severe lefty. I couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn with that. These are the grown-up pair of chaps, the 2nd pair he made for me. And he gave them to me also for my 4th birthday. They're a beautiful pair of cowhide slacks. He did all the decorations, all the trim. He did up on the top and the belt, cut and riveted, sewed. He even made that buckle. This is some of the skill still left in that old man's hands, in his fingers. And when he gave me these, I still have them. I've carried them with me all my life, and I believe they're going to go with me into my coffin. They were the best gift I ever was given. There's me, but doggone, it must have been yesterday, wearing the same hat, same shirt, and that's a friend named Tough. Not mine. Okay, I think that's them on the slides. Hang on a second. I have a short little reading that I wanted to share with you from the book, The Last Long Drive. And then maybe we can open up if you have any questions or comments. I'll be glad to deal with them. Okay. There's a lot to this book, but I figured since rodeos were such an important part of his life, and the rodeos actually started down in Texas around this time. They started as friendly competitions between neighboring ranches. The cowboys in different ranch would challenge the cowboys, and the rodeos were working skills that the cowboys had to do every day. And the betting would start almost immediately. Now there's two, I'm going to set this up. There are 2 ranches here in the book. The first ranch is the Bar L, and it's led by a man named Big Jim McCarty. That's the ranch that Seabird rides for, Seabird and his friend Luke. The ranch that they're going over to do this competition, they didn't use the word rodeo back then. That was developed a little later. They used words like cowboy stampedes, cowboy cavalcades, occasionally a rodeo. They all sort, whatever they could think of, Wild West shows, anything, before they finally settled on the word rodeo. But the other ranch was led by a man named, owned by a man named Josh Randall, and it's the Double Z. So the riders from the Bar L and the Double Z, and this is the scene. As McCarty's riders ride into, you'll see where the rodeo parade originated from. Whenever you go to a rodeo, they have all the riders come in and ride around, all the competitors. They actually started because riders from one ranch would have to ride over to the other ranch. Then they would parade around, and the riders from the ranch that was hosting it didn't want to be left out. They got in the parade too. So it ended up becoming a real common thing. Word of the challenge between the 2 ranches had spread throughout the neighborhood over the weekend. But the riders were still surprised to see so many buckboards and wagons from the surrounding spreads and from Mingo, too. The number of folks, they learned, rode all the way up from Rhymes to watch. The big corral with its attached holding pens and chutes were lined with spectators, including more women than the cowboys expected. In the buckboards, pulled up against the rail fence, sat a scattering of females, most with parasols to protect them from the glare of the hot Texas sun, but just as many young women dressed in riding jeans, boots, and hats rode the fence rail just like the men. When the men of the Bar L rode up, a cheer rose from those assembled. Big Jim was widely known and respected. He acknowledged their cheers by doffing his Stetson. One of the spectators opened a gate to allow them to ride into the arena, for such it had become. Not to be outdone by their guests, the cowboys of the Double Z mounted and quickly followed in parade. As all the riders walked their mounts slowly past the cheering, whistling, and waving spectators, an awestruck Luke leaned toward Seabird and asked in wonder, "Never in all my dreams, where did all these people come from?" Seabird smiled and replied as he tipped his feathered hat to a carrot-topped gal whistling from the top rail of the fence. "It's no secret, Luke. Those white folks breed like rabbits." It was not long before the competition began in earnest. But before that, the prize money was announced for the first three events: bronc busting, calf roping, and short distance racing. Everybody agreed Josh Randall and Big Jim McCarty were mighty fine men for staking such an amount, and the side betting along the fence rails and among the cowboys, competing or not, continued until the very moment a bronc would burst into the arena. Occasionally, someone would get a bit hot over some perceived insult, and fists would fly. But such scuffles were quickly broken up as the competition proceeded. Bronc busting was the first event. This was nothing new to the cowboys. Breaking in the half-wild mustangs was daily work on most ranches. And although many men tried their hand at it, the number who were actually gifted at the task were quite limited, and those few usually were rewarded with higher pay. It was a dangerous job, but it had to be done, as each working cowboy would use a number of horses each day, switching mounts regularly as they would tire. So a fresh supply was always necessary. Big Jim announced the rules for the competition from the back of his gray. "Okay, boys, listen up, because I don't like to chew my cabbage twice. Each one who signed up, when your name is called, pick out a bronc from the corral. The wranglers will drive it into the chute where you mount up. When you're ready, it will be released into the arena. You must keep one hand in the air at all times and continue to use the spur. Should you even so much as even slap the horse or grab the apple," here Jim rested his hand on the saddle horn, "you will be disqualified. If you're thrown, you will be disqualified. Ride the dang thing until it don't want to kick no more." Nodding to Randall and the man standing next to him, he continued, "Mr. Randall and I will be the judges, and I'm sure we'll always agree on the winner." He paused a few seconds to allow the derisive laughter to subside, and then wrapped it up. "But just in case of a split vote, the good Parson Gibbs here from Mingo has agreed to be the tiebreaker." The parson smiled, pleased to be incorporated into the program. "So, boys, the list of riders is posted on the gate. Get ready to mount up and let her rip." Never had anyone seen anything like this before. And as the morning wore on, there were the inevitable glitches. One double Z rider, settling onto his bronc, wedged a boot heel in the fence and broke an ankle before he even had a chance to show what he could do. Another time, a Bar L rider, having selected what looked like an energetic pinto, found that when the chute was opened, instead of bursting into the arena, the horse hopped a few times, spun once, stopped, and looked over its shoulder at its rider in mild annoyance. Spurring only made it dance a bit, then stop. The crowd roared, and the Double Z crew razzed the humiliated rider mercilessly, because experienced cowboys knew that pintos were notoriously poor horses. When it was Seabird's turn, he walked slowly around the corral, studying the horses carefully before fixing on a Mustang with an intelligent but mean glint to its eyes. From the way it moved among the other horses, Seabird could see it was a dominant stallion and would put on a good show. "That's the one I want," he pointed. "That big fellow, with the markings like a saddle that slipped over the left side. Yep, that's him." He watched approvingly as the wranglers cut out the horse, smoothly dropped a rope on him, and led him over to the chute. Astride the Mustang, wedged in the chute, Seabird could feel each muscular quiver and shiver that told him this horse could not wait to show its unwanted rider who was the one in control. Then, on the signal, the gate flew open. For the briefest moment, the stallion hesitated, but it was only to gather its strength for a twisting leap into the air that ended in a stiff-legged landing, jarring Seabird's bones to his teeth. This leap, in turn, led to another, which ended in a head-down, rear-up kick that nearly had the horse perpendicular, and Seabird wondering if, for the first time in his young life, he had met his match. Shifting his weight forward, nearly standing in the stirrups, he fought to anticipate the movements of the maddened horse and to identify and match its broken rhythms. First, he had no time to think. He could only react from moment to moment and hope he would survive another 2 seconds. When he successfully overcame the horse's first assault, though, his confidence began to return, and his admiration for the beast below him began to blossom, for its incredible strength and courage, for its willpower that seemed unbendable. Just as Seabird would begin to recognize bucking patterns, the big horse would alter them. Several times, the big horse nearly beat his rider. Once, in the middle of a sequence of leaping kicks, the stallion suddenly sunfished, and it was as much by good fortune as skill that Seabird did not end up in a crumpled pile in the dirt. It seemed as if this horse would never tire, that he would buck all morning and maybe all afternoon if he had a mind to. Seabird's ribs and spine were aching from the pounding, but then he slowly noticed a new sensation. He could hear the crowd along the fence cheering him on. Even the Double Z crew were lost in admiration for the skills the lithe cowboy was demonstrating. They knew this was how it should be done, how it was meant to be done, and how possibly they would never see it done again. He found he was sensing the tiny muscle movements beneath him that preceded the explosive leaps, kicks, and twists. Slowly, he began to move more successfully and match his moves to those of the powerful steed until his pain disappeared, to be replaced by an adrenaline-powered ecstasy. He knew that no matter what this animal did, he would not be displaced from the saddle. Unable to contain himself any longer, he let loose with a cry drawn deep from his people's past. It may have been a war cry. It may have been the sound a father would make on the birth of his firstborn son. Wherever it came from, it was a cry of triumph, soaring from his soul. The crowd heard it and responded with roars of its own. The horse heard it as well. From that moment on, it seemed there was a change in the dynamics of power in that arena. Now it was the rider urging the horse on. The crowd could see that second by second, the man in the saddle was taking charge. It was not as if the big stallion had lost heart. He was acknowledging, begrudgingly at first, the superiority of his rider's will. Once he came to a dead stop, snorting and panting, but clearly as yet untamed. Seabird removed his hat with his free hand and reached down beneath the horse's belly and fanned it several times. Startled by this unexpected behavior, the brute erupted in a new series of leaps to the delight of the crowd. Seabird had no time to replace his hat, so he just waved it in salute to the cheering crowd, the horse giving its all, and to a life where such things were possible. As his horse was winding down into what Seabird sensed were its final leaps, he waved his hat at the man minding the gate, signaling him to open it up. As the gate swung open and the big horse saw the open plains before him, he ceased his bucking and shot forward like an arrow released from the bow. Bent low over his flying mane, Seabird whispered in his ear, "Fly, big fella, fly." Rider and horse disappeared in a pounding of hooves and a cloud of dust. The gate remained open as the awed assemblage turned to watch and to count themselves fortunate to have been here at the birth of a legend. And that's where I get the title, The Legend of Seabird, from. Well, this concludes my presentation on The Last Long Drive.